On a warm Sunday night in October of 1871, the city of Chicago was calm. Families were finishing dinner, children were drifting off to sleep, horse wagons rattled softly along dusty streets. Nothing seemed unusual, but somewhere in the darkness, a small flame had just appeared inside a wooden barn. At first, no one worried. Fires happened all the time in a fast-growing city like Chicago. Yet this one was different, because that tiny flame was about to become a monster. Within hours, walls of fire would race through the city faster than people could run. Homes would collapse, entire streets would vanish. By the next morning, thousands of people would be standing in the cold waters of Lake Michigan just to escape the heat. And when the fire finally stopped, one of America's greatest cities would be reduced to ashes. But what happened after the flames died out would shock the entire nation, because the people of Chicago didn't leave. They rebuilt and created a new city that would change the future of America forever.
If you enjoy true historical stories and fascinating facts, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who loves history.
The night of October 8, 1871, began like any other in Chicago. The city was alive with the quiet rhythm of everyday life. Families sat around dinner tables while shop owners closed their stores for the evening. Horses pulled wagons down wooden streets, their hooves echoing between rows of closely packed houses. Chicago was booming. Only a few decades earlier, it had been a small trading outpost near Lake Michigan, but by 1871, it had exploded into one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. Railroads stretched in every direction. Trains arrived daily carrying grain from the Midwest, lumber from Wisconsin, and cattle from the Western Plains. Money flowed through the city. But beneath that success was a dangerous secret. Most of Chicago was made of wood. Wooden houses, wooden sidewalks, wooden barns and warehouses. Even many large buildings used wooden frames. And that summer had been brutally dry. For months, almost no rain had fallen. Grass had turned brown, trees had dried out, and the wooden buildings across the city had become dangerously brittle. Chicago had unknowingly turned itself into a giant pile of kindling. Late that Sunday evening, around 9 p.m., a small fire started in a barn belonging to the O'Leary family on Tacovin Street. According to a famous legend, a cow kicked over a lantern, igniting the hay. Whether that story is true or not, historians still debate. But one thing is certain: the fire was real. At first, it didn't seem like a disaster. Small fires happened frequently in Chicago, and the city's firefighters were used to responding quickly. When the alarm sounded, crews rushed toward Tacovin Street with horse-drawn fire engines. But several things went wrong. Earlier that night, firefighters had already battled another blaze and were exhausted. Equipment had been moved to different locations across the city. Then, the wind began to blow. Strong gusts from the southwest lifted burning embers from the barn and carried them through the air like glowing snowflakes. Those embers landed on nearby rooftops. Within minutes, several houses were on fire. The flames spread faster than anyone expected. Dry wood ignited instantly. The fire jumped from building to building, racing down narrow streets lined with tightly packed homes. Soon, entire blocks were burning. Firefighters fought desperately to stop the flames. They pumped water from hydrants and rivers, but the pressure was weak. Their hoses couldn't reach every building, and the wind kept growing stronger. By midnight, the fire had transformed into something terrifying. A massive wall of flames began moving toward the center of the city. People poured into the streets. Families grabbed whatever they could carry: blankets, clothes, photographs, and small bags of food. Some loaded wagons with furniture, while others ran with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The sky above Chicago turned bright orange. Witnesses later described the sound of the fire as a roar, like a giant storm sweeping through the city.
Sparks flew thousands of feet into the air, landing far ahead of the main flames and starting new fires everywhere. Warehouses filled with lumber burned like giant torches. Grain elevators exploded into towering fireballs. Even buildings made of brick couldn't survive the heat. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, iron beams bent and twisted. Then something even stranger appeared. People saw spiraling towers of fire rising into the sky. These were fire whirls, spinning columns of wind and flame that lifted burning debris high above the city and threw it across entire neighborhoods. Panic spread everywhere. Thousands of people fled toward the shoreline of Lake Michigan. The lake became their only escape. Families stood knee-deep in the cold water while fiery embers rained down around them. Some covered their heads with wet blankets while others prayed as the flames moved closer. All night long, the fire raged. Churches burned, schools collapsed, factories exploded as chemicals ignited. By the morning of October 9, huge sections of Chicago had already been destroyed. But the worst was still coming. The powerful wind pushed the fire across the Chicago River, something many people believed was impossible. They had assumed the river would stop the flames. It didn't. Burning debris carried by the wind landed on the other side and ignited new buildings. The fire kept moving. For more than 30 hours, Chicago burned. Finally, on the evening of October 9, the weather began to change. Clouds rolled in. Rain started to fall. The wind slowed. Exhausted firefighters slowly gained control of the flames. By the early hours of October 10, the nightmare was finally over. But the city left behind looked unrecognizable. More than 3 square miles of Chicago had been destroyed. Over 17,000 buildings were gone. Nearly 100,000 people, about 1/3 of the city's population, were suddenly homeless. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Miraculously, historians estimate that around 300 people lost their lives, a tragic number, but far fewer than many disasters of that scale. Still, the economic damage was staggering. Banks were gone. Businesses had burned. Important records had been destroyed. For a moment, it seemed possible that Chicago might never recover. But then, something remarkable happened. News of the disaster spread quickly across America. Through newspapers and telegraph messages, people learned what had happened. And help began pouring in. Cities across the United States sent money, food, clothing, and building materials. Aid even arrived from Europe and Canada. Relief tents appeared in parks and open fields, sheltering thousands of displaced families. But the most powerful response came from the people of Chicago themselves. They refused to abandon their city. Instead, they chose to rebuild. Construction began almost immediately. New building rules required safer materials like brick, stone, and steel. Streets were widened. City planners redesigned neighborhoods to prevent another disaster. Architects began experimenting with bold new building designs. Within a few decades, Chicago would become the birthplace of the modern skyscraper. Steel towers began rising higher than anything the world had seen before. The city that had once burned to the ground was reborn stronger than ever. Today, visitors standing beneath the towering skyline of Chicago might never imagine that much of the city was once reduced to ashes. But the story of the Great Chicago Fire remains one of the most powerful chapters in American history. It wasn't just a disaster. It was proof of something extraordinary. When everything was lost, the people of Chicago refused to give up. And from the ashes, they built a new city that would change the future of America.